Good morning. I've just seen recently a few thumbnails pop up in my YouTube as I log in to check stuff to try to respond to videos. So remember, Roleplay Cafe is Dell's channel, so I don't always know people have written Roleplay Cafe. Once in a while, I'll see a video or somebody will remind me of the video, and I'll see that people have commented and I'll try to respond. So I don't know when comments are put on Role Play Cafe is the point I'm making. So I don't always see your comments, therefore I don't always respond. And it's not personal. I literally don't know there's comments. So Dell does a pretty good job of responding to certain ones. Obviously, so please, in all the role play RPG videos, etc., RPG a day videos, all those things, if you made comments, I generally try to respond. I try to have a dialogue. But if I didn't, it's because I have no idea it was a comment. So do not take offense to that. Okay. And again, at some point, obviously, you get so many videos up, you can get inundated in comments, and it's not impossible to keep up anyway. But okay. But that's not what this video is about, as Ivan likes to say, right? So I will still one from Ivan. But that's not what this video is about. One D&D. So anyway, the point is, I've been seeing these one D&D thumbnails, right? And I'm like, well, okay, oh my, so it must be the new D&D, right? Sure enough, I guess it is. It's a playtest doc out, right? But I thought first, shouldn't it be one D&D? WON, one D&D? I mean, they won, right? I mean, they have the market share. They've had it since 1978, right? I think at this point, let's just let's just call it what it is. One D&D, right? D&D one, WON, right? That's the way I see it. So anyway, I have owned the fifth edition books. I ran a 5 session campaign for a local group that had four noobs in it. Right, and I say noobs; they were individuals who had never played a role playing game, and then Big Mike and Carl and his wife were part of that group. So there was like four of them had never played, and Carl, his wife, Megan, and Big Mike were part of that little 5 session campaign. And I promised them I would get them to the end of a 5 session thing, and they would level. I would get them to level 2 or 3, however D&D fifth edition levels up. And it was fun. Had a great time. And I talked about this before. Then I gifted my hardback books to those 4 players and the modules, whatever I had. I gifted them to put them on their journey into hopefully a future and a life of role playing. And then I've played, of course, I've run for my local guys. I had run the fifth edition Adventures in the Middle Earth um, set for fifth edition using the basic book. And I will say this: I actually love the D&D fifth edition basic free PDF, the basic book free PDF. It just keeps the game narrowed down and all these extraneous races and all this stuff. I kind of like that simple D&D structure. The game itself, of course, is not different. And I've always said before, I don't dislike Dungeons and Dragons fifth edition. I didn't really dislike fourth edition. They were a different experience. I will say it was an experience that I was completely and utterly foreign to me, and I was unaccustomed to it when I first came back to gaming. And I saw it, and I thought, what the hell happened to Dungeons and Dragons? And you got to understand, I've been away for 18 years, so it was a brutal kind of cold water in the face. What is this? This is not. This is crazy. And then, of course, Pathfinder was a version of 3.5, and I had never seen D&D 3, D&D 3.5. I played a little second edition AD&D. Well, I might have. I can't remember if I actually played second edition. Yeah, I did actually play second edition AD&D as a player in 1 or 2 odd games in my 20s as a player, but never GM'd it. Right. So, but anyway, it's like I don't know how long D&D's been out now. What are we in fifth years? Are we 5 years into this process? Right. I think we're 5 years into fifth. And instead of 5.5 or the next edition, they're obviously working now toward the future. And I'm assuming this will be out in 2 or 3 years, which will make about 8 year run for fifth. Now I may be wrong. Fifth edition may have been out now for already 8 years or something. I don't know. So again, my life, my hobby does not revolve around Dungeons and Dragons, and has not revolved around Dungeons and Dragons since I was 20 years old, 19 years old. So it is my background, is my experience in my young hobby, but it doesn't revolve around D&D and hasn't since I've returned, right? OSRs, which are a version of old D&D, yes. Okay. So I just thought about this. Why the pretense? Why one D&D? Why not WON D&D, right? So I just thought that's kind of funny. Anyway, uh, and I don't know what all they're changing. I'm assuming, hopefully, I hate to say this, hopefully they've learned from the innovations in the industry, and the changes they're making maybe to the actual D&D formula are actually important changes and not just a restructuring of the same concepts redistributed. And I get the feeling from a couple of the short videos I've seen, like there's no longer racial bonuses. Those bonuses are now background bonuses because, again, what you shouldn't be. And I get it, right? We don't want to say I want to be an elf, but I don't. I want the bonus to be on my intelligence, not on my dexterity. And again, I get they're trying to say go ahead and be an elf and pick this background if you want a bonus to your intelligence, right? As opposed to the elf punishing your strength or bonusing your dexterity. When as a player, I want to be an elf, but not that elf. That They're still bonuses, but they allow you to play an elf or a dwarf that's not going to be affected or punished by these racial bonuses, right? And to be honest, that kind of makes sense, right? Oddly enough, though, in a game that has races and classes and they direct a particular role, right? Uh, it also is not wrong to have the race bonuses, right, based on the fantasy world they're ascribing. So, as somebody who I'll talk about this again as a developer of sports tabletop games. I won't talk so much about role playing. I mean, yes, we have written and developed Dark Age of Man, and that's my one experience. That's my one box, right? That I've worked as a developer inside. So I would consider myself a grand noob of role playing game design. And again, ultimately, structured literally on what the system we're trying to present to players with guidelines, right? So the great quote for great experiences or great art to come, for somebody to be a great artist or have a great experience, there has to be constraints. It's working within those constraints that make great art. It's following the rules of music that allow an artist to compose the thing that is truly remarkable. It's following the rules of art that allows an artist to make amazing art. Now, again, once you know those rules, you can break some of those rules, right? Great artists often were masters, and then they broke all the rules. You earn the right, so to speak. Okay, but my point is, constructs help us actually achieve the thing. If we don't put a border on this window, then we're outside, right? And so, what I can do in this house, I have free will. I have a whole lot of options in this house, right? In which I can conduct a way of life and not necessarily leave this house, leave this room, but there are certain rules and laws, right? So anyway, and I don't know what else they're changing in that, and I'm not going to download and peruse the document. I think it's a beta document because I wouldn't know what I'm comparing it to as far as fifth edition, in that I haven't studied or played enough edition to recognize the differences. But hopefully there are some significant changes to I hate to say it, maybe the system in how it informs players to be active, responsible for their own narration, responsible for driving their portion of the experience, as opposed to being led around by the nose, right, by a storyteller, so to speak. So I'm hoping to see some things that kind of change the nature of Dungeons and Dragons as a system. I really hope they explore the ideas of characters and their abilities having an effect that's not just combat effects, right? Not just more dice of damage, not just more to hit bonuses. That we start seeing maybe more spells that are narrative or are story driven in a way, as opposed to just math driven bombs, right? Of the magic bomb, the magic cannon, the magic. It just seems to me magic is so much combat in Dungeons and Dragons. And then, of course, character bloat. The idea that characters just get so big that it's just echeloned up. And I'll be honest, one of the reasons I don't touch D&D, I really would not want to run 5 players at 6th level in a campaign session. The prep that would go into preparing something on a monthly or bi-monthly basis for a group of 6 characters that are pretty damn powerful, to me, it would just be an incredibly difficult work. So I just think those games become very hard for the GM to keep interesting and to keep threatening, etc. But that's me, right? That's the nature of why I run low fantasy, a different style of game, right? So anyway, I just thought it's kind of fascinating. So one D&D apparently clearly on this way. I guess at some point, curiosity would better me, and I will probably download the beta documents and take a gander. I do have the basic D&D. I used to have the beta playtest D&D fifth edition set, and I never looked back to see how the actual fifth edition basic PDF varied from those rules. I'm assuming over 200,000 people contributed to the evolution of fifth edition before it was put, published. So I'm assuming there were quite a few changes and adjustments that occurred in that window. And I'm assuming they're doing the same here. They're trying to get good playtesting and they're trying to get good feedback. But the one thing I could speak to is this idea of backgrounds informing your bonuses versus your race informing your bonuses. And the only thing I can glean from that is they're trying to allow players to be a halfling without being locked into being a rogue type character all the time, right? Could you be a halfling warrior or a halfling wizard, etc.? So I think they're trying to minimize some of the things that get in the way of me being a competent halfling wizard, so to speak. And I think that's probably a wise decision if you want to let players stretch out and develop their own actual characters in this world of D&D. But getting back to my original point, when you develop and design a game and you put limitations, constructs on that, you are saying, well, that's because we're really saying elves in this world don't do that. Your elf wants to do that. Well, this isn't the right game for that. You need to be playing this game where elves can be that thing. So I guess the gist of what I'm saying is broadening in D&D to where it can be that makes sense in competition with other games that say, why can't an elf be this? Why can't a halfling be this? Why can't a dwarf be this thing? So it makes sense in recognizing broad fantasy and certainly the limitations that those structures put on it. But like the idea of the original game, a thief has these skills. That's what they do. They have weaknesses, but they have things that no one else can do. And clerics have things no one else can do in fighters. So there's a role. That's your role, and there's nothing wrong with you playing the cleric of the party and Joe playing the thief of the party. And there's a lot of fun that can be had in recognizing those limitation structures are actually part of the game design. They're part of the intent of the game. Maybe that wasn't what they meant when they created the game, but that's 100% what it imparts to us. And 40 years later, looking back at these games, it clearly becomes the written rule. It becomes the intent of the game, regardless of some obscure interview with Gary Gygax 15 years later when he says, well, that wasn't what I meant. Well, then you should have wrote it clearer or something like that. So my point is, there would be nothing wrong with D&D saying we're going to keep these limits on elves, because in the D&D fantasy world, elves aren't going to be good at these things, or humans they're not going to live to be 185 years old, right? And so those become those design elements become what binds D&D to a particular kind of fantasy. So I've heard the best example, I remember Lee, talking with Lee, your humble game master, and he talked about how D&D, one of the problems with D&D is it's this broad fantasy. It's kind of everything. It's kind of all over the place. And there's some truth in that. But its actual game design and its actual intent did inform the kind of fantasy it was intending to be. It may not have had details of a world in the book. It may not have details of a setting. But if you just take what is a cleric, and the limitations on cleric do actually inform what kind of fantasy world we're going to be playing in today. The limits on the elf, the limits on the thief, the limits on the halfling, they actually do tell us what kind of fantasy today we are playing if I give you no other information, right? And I think that's been lost in the 45 years of game design and game development, that it may have been broad in that it included the concepts, the vast appendix in references, so to speak, but the actual game design really did give us an idea of what a cleric was and what it was meant to be in this fantasy world. It should have cued the DM of how undead is really ultimately viewed in this world, and how it is actually embraced by something a particular type of character can do against undead. right? And so I think those are things that are also okay. It's okay for a game to say clerics can't wield bladed weapons. And there'll be the guy who says, Crusaders did, Templars did. Well, cleric is not a Templar. It's not a historic Templar. It's not necessarily a Crusader, right? It is what D&D defined it as. It defined it as this thing, this human structure that wore a particular kind of armor and wielded a particular kind of weapon based on its fiction of blunt weapons and its limitations in your religious sect, which was not defined. I mean, I give early D&D credit that it didn't define the gods. It didn't define your imagination of your religion. I love the fact that a few years ago on Skype, I ran a Holmes game for Scott and Aaron and Jim and I think Rich was involved in that game, and they, Scott could come up with this pretty remarkable choleric that he defined. He defined his name, he defined his culture, he defined it all in one simple phrasing of who his character was and the weapon he carried, et cetera, et cetera. It allowed Scott to create his god and his thing, right? And I think there's a lot of joy in that. When I sit down to play in a campaign world that is limited, I have to follow those gods. I can still embrace a character that believes in these gods, but there's some joy, and also my choleric might believe in some obscure god and is in this party to do a thing as a pittance to save his soul. All that's my doing, right? And why would your cleric be here doing this? Well, my cleric, part of the creed for him to get into his heaven is he must sacrifice himself in a mysterious world in which he faces potential dangers that would be anti to his god. And that's why he happens to be in this troop of treasure hunters, right? So we are free to create those things. So I don't know exactly what all rules they're looking to change, et cetera, but it sounds like that's an interesting, and what that's going to do is make your background more influential, right? And again, this would play into modern psychology, right? Behavioral psychology versus environmental psychology, right? We're claiming our background dictates who we are more so maybe than our genes, more so maybe than our background. So I think these are all in a way modern psychological understanding of what makes us who we are, what gives us our strengths is not somewhat genetic, not so much birth related. It could also be quite literally how you grew up, right? And I think there's obviously that there's a ton of truth in behavioral psychology and experience giving us what we are good at or what we are knowledgeable about, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So it's kind of interesting, but I had to talk about this because it's already, it seems to me it's been very short time, fifth edition has been running. And I do believe they're also ultimately going to close the IP, right? They're going to close that license off to only Wizards of the Coast material. So all of this great work I think has been done by third parties will ultimately be cut off, right? You'll have to make your homebrew and provide it free under the table in PDFs, etc., because there's not going to be any more licensing for the support of these third party companies. And I I I don't know what to think about that. If it means that Dungeons and Dragons, let's put it this way, I do hope the people at Wizards of the Coast are the best and the brightest when it comes to new creative endeavors, because they have to be. Because if they're that, or you're going to end up with one D&D being a very small window of things that are released that are official, so to speak. And therefore, they better have some really bright writers and some really great thinkers that come up with some really interesting stuff. If not, I mean, they're cutting off third-party ideas and innovations that actually supported D&D. I would argue D&D 5th Edition's market share not only started its run on Pathfinder's control, because I think it was an easier game to get into. It was, and it did resemble more the game many of us grew up with, and it certainly resembled the game pre 4th edition. And I think that made it more accessible. But I think the support from this giant community of writers and developers and game companies really aided 5th edition on its run. I mean, I've got Arcadia for 5th edition. I loved Adventures in Middle Earth for 5th edition. And I also have, what's the other 5th edition campaign world that Eloy turned us on to a few years ago? Eloy, because I have Arcadia, which is the Greek mythology for 5th edition world with its, apparatus to apply to the 5th edition game that can be used with basic edition or whatever, or any edition of 5th edition. And then, of course, Adventures in the Middle Earth was the Lord of the Rings support for 5th edition. And then there's a lot of them. And then again, I can't remember, but Eloy turned us on to one that's very cool, which is, I think, it might have also been Bronze Age campaign world. I can't remember the name of that one now. Anyway, point is, we never played them. At least I didn't play it. I haven't played them. I haven't run them or played them. So anyway, I just thought this is kind of interesting. I'm not certain. Somebody in the comments would have to tell me how long has D&D 5th edition actually been published. I think 20. I want to say 20. I have the basic. Let me pull up my basic book. Let's take a look. I do have the free basic. The only thing I kept was the basic free, because if I ever ran D&D 5th, I felt that's all I would need. Where is the darn thing now? Basic 2018 are the basic rules I have. I don't believe that's when it was published, though. Playtesting was provided by over 175,000 fans provided feedback in the playtesting. That's pretty remarkable. What a great resource to get how many years of that many people giving feedback to a system, and I think that really helped it. It just says 2018 Wizards of the Coast is what I have here on this, but I have a feeling the game's a little older than that as far as when it was originally released. So don't hold me to that, but let's just assume this is actually okay. This is D&D Basic Rules version 1, released November 2018. So that's almost 2019, 2020, 2020. 3 years. We're 3 years in based on this data. We're 3 years in to the biggest brand in tabletop role-playing history, Dungeons and Dragons, and we're already looking at another edition, and I think it's very interesting. And anyway, good luck to them. I have no clue what it'll look like or what it'll be like, and I won't prejudge it because it could be remarkable. It could be the edition that somehow, some way wins me back into Dungeons and Dragons. But when I look at D&D, I'm still looking at Mulvey. I'm still looking at Holmes. I'm looking at Mincer. I'm still looking at, heck, I would even look at a D&D first edition. If I'm going to go back to Dungeons and Dragons, I'm going to be going back to the broken, old, archaic rubbish of rules, right? And that works for me. So anyway, thanks for watching. Just had to talk about this. Very, very interesting.